Today I'm speaking with Lorena Hieronymus. Lorena, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And I don't know too much about Lorena, but I do know a few things, and we're going to get to know her together. Lorena is from Moscow, Idaho, and she's currently living in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which makes our timing of our syncing up of our interview time a little bit easier since I'm on the East Coast as well. She's a mom of two little ones, 6 and 3, and she's also, in terms of her work, she's a disability advocate, a community inclusion specialist, and advocate for mental health, and she's also a writer. So that's what I know about you so far. What else can we know about you?
Most of my life revolves around disability advocacy, and there's a lot of focus on health and wellness and mental health as well.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's awesome. I'm sure a lot of people appreciate what you're doing to help them get through the difficulties of life, especially with some of those disabilities. In terms of why we're here today, we wanted to hear your story. This is going to be a little bit different from most of my interviews, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do a follow-up later and just hear your story the way I usually interview people. But you have a little bit of a different story. You come, as far as I'm aware, you come from a group that I would consider a cult, and a lot of other people would, very high controlling cult. And basically, you had an inside understanding of some of the dynamics that were going on there that other people didn't from an outside perspective. So I wanted to just pass the floor to you and hear your story, whatever you have on your heart to share with us tonight.
I grew up in a town called Moscow, Idaho, and I was raised in a cult called Christ Church under Douglas Wilson. And I know a lot of people are familiar with him and his work. The cult is very misogynistic in many ways. It focuses really strongly on disempowering women and empowering the white man. One of the things we were taught was that black skin was the mark of Cain. I remember hearing that in Sunday school very early on.
Wow, I did not
Very,
realize that they taught that. That's crazy. I heard that
yeah,
at Bob Jones University, but I did not realize they taught it too.
yeah. It was something that was said pretty often early on. And now I think because of a lot of movements, they have quieted it down a lot. But I do know that New St. Andrews teaches on, there is some curriculum that focuses on slavery and the benefits of slavery, not just to the owners of the slaves, but to the slaves themselves. So it's very unhealthy.
And is it correct? Doug actually wrote a book about that.
Yes,
Yeah,
I didn't read it personally, and I don't want to.
yeah. I've read a few quotes from it. It definitely seems like he's basically saying that was beneficial to slaves in many ways to be in that slave master relationship of the early United States. Is that correct as far as you understand as well?
Yes, absolutely, and it's completely wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just as we dive into your story, I do want to ask, can you set the stage for like how you were connected? Like what was your family already there when the church was there? Did you move there? Like how did you all get actually originally connected to Christ Church and to Doug Wilson?
My family moved to Moscow, Idaho when I was very young. I was probably between 4 and 6. And my dad and mom found the church after moving there and they thought it'd be a good fit. And I guess it was for them. It's
Did you,
once you join, it's almost impossible to get out.
in what sense?
You build connections there. All of your friends end up being there because they teach very strongly that anybody outside of Christ Church is not a real Christian. There's a stigma against anybody that is even Christian and not in Christ Church.
Hmm,
We don't associate with anybody outside of it, especially not worldly people.
hmm,
And so if you leave the church, you're basically shunned and you lose all your friends, your connections in the community. And now that Christchurch is so large and it takes up most of the town, it's you lose everything and potentially you could lose your income as well. A lot of people have to move away to a different state or a different town to recover.
hmm. Is it correct that they've stated that their goal is to make Moscow a Christian town?
It's deeper than that. It's about controlling the town entirely. Doug Wilson's father wrote a book about spiritual warfare and how to take over towns and even countries
Hmm,
using spiritual warfare. And it is something that has been in the works for decades. And at this point, from what I've heard, recently talking to another community inclusion specialist that works in Moscow, Idaho, in my line of work. They own the majority of buildings downtown, and
Mm.
they have a very strong presence in Moscow, stronger even than when I left 10 years ago.
So they're literally just trying to buy the place up and take over.
Yes,
Would, as far as you know about the movement, the bigger movement called Christian nationalism to take over the country and hopefully from the perspective of the world for Christ, would you call them Christian nationalists?
absolutely, in every sense.
Mm.
They focus on the oppression of women and pushing out anybody and persecuting anybody that isn't part of them and doesn't agree with them. And they very forcefully attack and slander anybody who speaks out against them.
Mm. So you moved there as a small child. What were some of your other earliest memories of getting plugged into the church?
I remember walking into what I don't even know if it's the Logos school building anymore, but it used to be an ice rink, and that's where I went to school. They converted it into Logos. The auditorium was where we had church services at the time, and I think it was shortly after Doug Wilson had taken over preaching, which he is self-ordained and nobody appointed him. Um, it's a whole mess behind all that. But that being said, I remember walking in and there were several families. The auditorium was fairly full. Um, I remember I went to, it may have been one of my friend's baptisms at the Atwood's house. And I remember Doug Wilson picking me up and holding me. And I remember feeling very uncomfortable. And one of the things that I remember very strongly is that I never liked him and I never felt safe around him. I was always really scared of him. And I guess I had good reason. My intuition was very good. It turns out all the men that I was uncomfortable around at the time and all throughout my childhood turned out to have some sort of something brought against them later on, abuse wise.
Hmm. And it seems like that's been a recurring theme with them for people that really kind of dig into the whole history as well as the current context of what's going on there. They have had
Mm-hmm.
a number of cases where there's a lot of evidence that they're either directly abusing people or that they're covering for abusers and letting abusers remain in places where they shouldn't be, even marrying uh,
Mm-hmm.
girls off to sexual predators. Story of one lady that I was in contact with that it seemed like they were willing to side with the abuser, and when the abused woman spoke up, they literally went after her and attacked her repeatedly to a point that she, like you said, she had to move on and move out of the area because it was so severe. It
I was unfortunately part of that. I was one of the people that was very hurtful towards her.
mm,
And I remember that very clearly, believing that she was somebody to not be associated with, somebody I judged very harshly. I was probably 13 at the time,
mm,
13, 14, something like that. And I remember I was taught to feel disgust for her, unfortunately. And I have a very strong memory of one time that she and her family were behind us in church, and she has the most beautiful singing voice. And she was singing her heart out. And I remember looking back at her in disgust. And we talked as a family later. And my mom and I were very adamant about how she sounded horrible and she was just not a good person. And I remember truly believing that because that's what I had been taught to believe.
mm. And this the context just for people that don't know what we're talking about. So as a young teenager, she was in her parents' house, and as other people in Moscow do, they invite some of the college students to board with them. And I'm sure some people it's a very good situation where they're basically feeling like they're not all alone. They've got kind of an adopted family to help them through the college years. But in that case, he ended up grooming her as a young girl, young teenager, to basically become sexually involved. And it was basically something that should have ended up going where he goes to prison for a very long time. And instead of them protecting her, they ended up attacking her repeatedly. And from what I understand, even years after it was done, they still kind of kept the narrative going to just continually pound those nails that they were going to attack her until she basically let it go, even though they basically said, we're not going to believe you that this was not your fault, even though you were a minor. And now we're going to make you basically pay for it, that you're not looking like one of us. You're not going to fall under the authority of the male leadership of this church. From what I understand from a somewhat of an outsider's perspective to it, they basically ruined her life after she'd already been severely traumatized by what she'd been through. But they basically took that situation where this person who was very much needing loving kindness and support and to be believed and to be helped through this, instead they threw her under the bus and made her look like she was the problem instead of someone that needed to be taken care of. Is that your understanding of kind of the emotional context of how it evolved?
It's even worse than that. They even attacked her husband and they ruined his career as well.
Hmm.
But they even now speak out against her, even now that she has apologized. It got to the point that she apologized pretty publicly for being an advocate. She stepped away entirely and refused to talk about her story anymore to protect her own peace of mind. And they still speak very badly of her, but they did traumatize her deeply, and they worked for over a decade to try to bring her down, essentially.
Hmm. The more that I hear about these kind of situations, and I know we'll dive into some more, but does it remind you a little bit of mafia tactics? A little bit?
I don't know much about mafia tactics, but I do know about other cults like Jehovah's Witness. They're one that does the same thing, the shunning and the attacking. And it's very similar in that way, where the families, even of the people that speak out about the abuse or speak out about the cult, the families will shun them as well.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of people that refuse to speak out about their abuse. And I know of at least one in particular, a young man who refuses to speak out because his family is still connected and he knows that their lives will be ruined potentially if he speaks out.
Yeah. I got to just say, before we dive into the next section, just stepping back as a former Christian, and for anyone that doesn't know me, I was a Christian for 40 years and went to Bible college to become a pastor and a missionary. Loved the Lord, loved the Word, and so forth. And then I deconverted after many years of digging deep into the origins of Christianity and Judaism. But I was the kingdom of God and the church and the ministry and missions was my passion. And to hear the church being about what you're telling me that they're about in Moscow, Idaho, at Christ Church, and I know they've got some sister churches now connected to them, but to think that that's what they're about, is this intimidation and control, is just mind-boggling. And I often when I look at this, I think, how do you think the people in that group don't see it? Like, why don't they look at this and say, this is really toxic? Like, what attracts them? Especially people move there specifically for this church, even, right?
They do.
Like, what
They do,
attracts
yes.
them to this?
Well, a lot of the people that do end up going specifically for the church and for the college aren't aware of the abuse that's happening. They see what looks like the ideal utopia of Christianity, where the women are beautiful, which is one thing they really capitalize on and say all the time, we have the most beautiful women. Um, the women stay home and cook and clean. They're subservient and silent, and they serve their husbands. And they're silent about everything. The children are well behaved because they're beaten, but they don't know that. Um, the men seem like upstanding young men and older men who are pretty high up in the community. And it looks like an idealistic situation. And even the town itself, now that Christchurch has taken over so much, it's a very conservative town, and that draws a lot of other Christians. And I know from other families that I've spoken to that left Christchurch and actually moved to North Carolina, they expressed that it seemed like a very good Christian community. The community of Christchurch itself, when you are obedient, when you are following all the rules, when your family is following all the rules and you look good and everything's squeaky clean and shiny, you have a community around you that will help you through anything. So no matter what you go through, no matter what your struggles are, everyone will rally to you, which is one of the reasons people don't want to leave. Even when they see all the bad things, they don't want to lose the community and their friends. And because they cut you off so entirely from the rest of the world, you feel like you're going to be alone completely and utterly. And you aren't going to have any supports when you leave because all of your supports are within the church.
Mm. So they really make it easy to stay, but hard to leave. It's it's mind-boggling to me though, from the women's perspective. You mentioned a few things about the way that women are treated. I'd love to dive into that some more, but just as maybe a starting question for that topic, why don't women seem to be more concerned about the way that they're treated? And if I could, before you answer that, I wanted to read a list of some words here. And for anyone that's watching with children, you might want to pause it or come back to this later time when the kids aren't around. I want to read a list of some words that Doug Wilson has used about women. He has called them in his, blog and his videos and his books. He's called them bitter, catty, unsubmissive, small-breasted biddies, unattractive, feminist scientists, unhappy, ungodly, lumberjack dykes, easy lays, harridans, crones, termagants, harpies, bimbo queens. He's used all those terms to refer to women, and in many contexts, women that he is very adamantly attacking, or
Yes.
against their worldview. How do women look at someone like that and say, "This is our founder"? At least I think is at least co-founder, if not founder of the group. Um, he's their, as you said, the unchosen pastor, the one that was not ordained, and yet they're going to look at this as the best version of Christianity. I mean, even from an outsider's perspective, whether you're a Christian or atheist, it looks like he is really, really misogynistic, like to a point that even usual, like typical patriarchal people wouldn't go to the point of using those kind of names for women. How do women in that community look at him and say, "We're proud to be under his umbrella of authority"?
That all comes back to the grooming behavior. They don't just groom the children, they groom the women as well, and the men, honestly, to believe everything he puts out. Um,
Mm,
there's a very deep teaching that I was um, subjected to as a child that women are inherently evil. Their bodies make men sin. We are essentially worthless. We are meant to be domestic slaves and silent and nothing more. And if we deviate from what, and again, they seclude you. This is all you hear because anybody else's ideas are not godly or not as godly, and you don't want to be led into sin. And so they use fear as a tactic a lot of times, and they teach these terrible things and brainwash, especially the women, into thinking that this is the way to honor the Lord and this is the way to honor your husband. And anybody that doesn't fall under that, even the women shame them and even the women hate them and support his calling them these names.
mm. It blows my mind to think about.
I I was of the same mindset as those women for my childhood and young adulthood.
In that context, if you had not deviated from that path, what would you have called your ideal adult life? Like, what would that have looked like for a young woman who'd grown up in the church? What were the next few steps? What was your 20s and 30s and 40s supposed to look like in that community?
You marry a man from NSA, ideally, or I mean, yeah, ideally NSA, but if a Christchurch member, young man, goes to University of Idaho, that's okay too, but it's preferable for you to have a good St. Andrews graduate husband. Um, you do all the potlucks. You have the white picket fence. You cook and you clean and you have children and you say yes to your husband's every whim. One of the things that I was taught from an early age, and that my mother even said to me very clearly when I asked her, was that if your husband wants to sleep with you, you have to say yes. You don't have a choice. There's no such thing as marital rape.
Hmm. That's
Um,
incredible.
so, yeah, ideally, I would be in the kitchen. I would be teaching my children about God, and I would be teaching them to follow the same rules I learned as a child. I would be taking them to Logos and dropping them off and picking them up after. I would be making dinner for my husband, and I would not be asking questions, and I would not have a career. I would not try to work. I would do whatever my husband wanted and basically be a domestic slave for the rest of my life.
And part of the way that they're, I'm assuming, presenting that as a positive thing is that the fight against feminism is this idea that if, well, you can serve in the workplace or you can serve your family, but either way you're going to be doing something, so why not focus on your home? And there is certainly value in people working in different venues, but the way they phrase it, it seems like, is that, and not just them but others definitely do as well, but the idea that this is the only path, this is the best path, and almost to the point where if you don't live like this as a woman, it's borderline ungodly. I'm
Yes.
sure there's some rare exceptions, like if you're a missionary or a nurse or something, where you have to have
Mm-hmm.
a job and save someone's life or something or spread the gospel. But by and large, most women are expected to get married fairly young, I think, from what I
Mm-hmm.
see, and produce as many babies as possible. Is that part of the culture?
Yes.
Is it? Would you call it? What do they call it? Quiverful? Is it quiverful?
I wouldn't say that. You have as many kids as you choose to have, well,
Okay.
as your husband wants to have.
Hmm. So
And
if you mentally said you're kind of done at 4 and
and
he
he
wants
wanted
5,
another one, you have another one because your body doesn't belong to you. It belongs to your husband and to God.
hmm. I'm hearing a recurring theme, and from what you say, I've read, they really don't like you to have autonomy, do they? They want to control
Absolutely
you.
not. Absolutely not. We don't have a voice. We don't have autonomy over our own bodies. Um, our opinions don't matter unless they line up with the men's opinions.
Hmm.
The man is the head of the household and he is to be your Lord, and you do whatever he says without question.
Yeah, which
It's
even
not
says
healthy.
it, that I think in first or second Peter, call him Lord like
Mm-hmm.
Sarah did Abraham. When you when you read some of the stuff online about Christ Church, there's little stories, and you never know what to think as a somewhat outsider. And I wanted to ask you about one of those stories. That's an anecdote I heard. I heard that it's possible, if your wife doesn't do dishes, that and you tell her please do them and she doesn't, that you can take her in front of the church elders. Is that kind of stuff correct, or is that a stretch? Or have you ever heard of
That's not a
reasons that they?
stretch at all. It's not
Okay.
a stretch at all. What happens is that they go before the church elders, and they try to work it out with counseling oftentimes. And of course, they don't have licensed therapists or counselors. It is the elders or the pastor or the pastor's wife, oftentimes, who counsels the woman in her sin. And if she doesn't straighten up and fly right, then she goes on the prayer list. And that is not a place you want to be, because at church, at a certain time, they announce the people that we need to pray for because they're living in sin. And that is a way of publicly shaming them, which is a way of forcing them into compliance.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times, if you're on that prayer list, then your friends don't really want to spend time with you because you're seen as almost dirty in a way, undesirable to be around. And until you are off that prayer list and back in the good graces of the church and the pastor, your friends will not want to spend time with you
Hmm.
because they don't want
How,
to be associated.
if you were to see a situation where a woman was being abused by her husband, physical, verbal, whatever, emotional, where he is just raking her over the coals, and let's say that when he says something like she's not doing what I want or she's displeasing me in some way, and instead what's actually happening is he's just kind of raking her over the coals emotionally or even hurting her physically. how does Christ Church respond typically in situations like that where the woman says, yeah, yeah, yes, I'm not perfect. I might have something I need to improve on, but this isn't one of those situations where we need to just kind of, you need to fix a little bit of you, and I need to fix a little bit of me, and we'll work together to become a more unified couple. Where this is a situation where she is claiming, I'm actually being abused here. Like this is a different kind of situation from the normal Christ Church conversations. Somebody's hurting me a lot. How do they handle that?
Oftentimes, these women will go to their friends first and express their concerns. And usually, the women say, well, my husband does this to me too, and you have to let it happen. A lot of that is to do with sexual abuse. Um, I do
Hmm.
know a story of one woman who came forward anonymously, and her husband had been abusing her horribly sexually. It was extremely violent, and it went on for years because her friends told her, you can't say no to your husband and you have to obey him. Now, if it gets very serious and she goes to the elders, the pastor, they try to figure out what it is she is doing wrong to cause this behavior. And if there's nothing that she feels she's doing wrong, they will try to point something out that they see as a flaw in her, or they'll tell her that it's her job, her duty as his wife to accept the way he treats her. And they may speak to him and counsel him on better ways of handling certain things. But again, they're not therapists and they're not counselors, and their priority is to keep women in line and silent, not to help them out of abusive situations. Abuse runs rampant in the church.
Hmm. I do want to ask on the note of abuse in some weird situations. Were you at the college and then school at the time of the Sittler situation?
I do remember the wedding. I didn't attend, I don't believe, but I do remember it going on, and I remember them getting married.
Okay.
I was out of school at that point, I think, or I was about to take my GED. I don't I don't really remember very much about it while it was happening because everything was very much swept under the rug. And also that stuff didn't really come up until I had left Moscow and I read the story. So I wasn't really involved in all of that. I didn't see much of the behind the scenes.
Yeah, from what I understand, it was a situation where a guy who'd been accused of molesting children repeatedly was basically put under the authority and counseling of the church, and
And he was
then
a registered sex offender.
yeah,
He wasn't
regis-
just accused of it, he had been convicted.
yeah. From what I read, enough that he could have spent his whole life behind bars,
Mm-hmm.
and but then they kind of counseled or rehabilitated him in their words, perhaps, and got him to a point where they were considering him marriage material, which is crazy to think about. And then they married him off to one of the young ladies of the church, knowing, of course, that if they're a normal couple, they're going to have children. So you're
Mm-hmm.
having a convicted sex offender, child molester in a situation where he's going to have his own children eventually. Um, from what did you ever hear of how the Christchurch community responded to that as the allegations kind of came to light?
Everything was very much swept under the rug, and anybody who spoke out about it was silenced quickly by Doug Wilson and his cronies. Um, I do know that when they did have a child, he admitted to being aroused by the child when he changed his diaper. And then after that, he had to have a chaperone whenever he was around the child. I do know that um, nobody really cared
Yeah.
because the whole thing was the will of the great Doug Wilson, and nobody questions Doug Wilson.
Mm.
And they sweep it under the rug to the extent that nobody pays it any attention, and they redirect and they find other ways of getting people's attention so that they aren't paying attention to that.
Yeah. Do you think there are some people that go through that group that feel like they're completely like if they're maybe oblivious to a lot of it, that it's just a normal good church?
Yeah, I mean, there are families. I did have a couple friends that are still in the church and they never experienced any abuse, and their families are functional. Their lives are great. They're married, having kids, living the Christchurch dream, white picket fence and all. So, and they seem very happy and good for them. But the fact that they are so brainwashed to ignore everybody coming forward and to judge them and hate them breaks my heart. I
Mm.
have one friend in particular. She was my best friend growing up. And after I stopped attending, I was still living in Moscow for several years. And I remember showing up at the local coffee shop, and her then fiance and her sister and her husband showed up. And there was a long table in the middle, and I was sitting at it, and they took seats near it. And I tried to catch her eye because I wanted to talk to her and say hi because I still cared about her. She had stopped talking to me years before. Um, and there was an interesting altercation between her and her sister where her sister was like, "Are you going to say hi to her?" Kind of like silently, like giving the eyes and gesturing to me. And she goes, just like, I like I'm something dirty, something she doesn't want to associate with. And all because at that point I'd left the church. I hadn't spoken up about anything to anybody. I just was no longer part of the church. I was still a Christian at that time as well.
Mm. Just a couple clarifying questions on some of the things we've been talking about. Do if I understand correctly what you're saying, a woman can't say no to her husband in terms of sexual interest, right? She has to.
Correct.
Okay. Do do some of the women ever claim then that they're saying no, and then he's proceeding anyway,
Yes.
which is rape at that point? Like you mentioned, there's no marital rape in their eyes, but do some women claim that they're being raped, and how does that play out if they make such a claim?
They're counseled and told to be obedient to their husbands, essentially. And when they speak to other women in the church in the past, they've been told by those women that, yes, my husband does this too. And it's our duty to do our jobs as their wife and just take it because that's what the Bible says. And that's how we're godly. And it keeps them from going into sexual sin, like watching porn or anything else, cheating, whatever it may be.
I was going to ask exactly that question. So they're being sexually available as at almost all times, based on the sense that this is your responsibility as a Christian woman, but also you're protecting your man because, however you'd phrase it, his sex drive, if it doesn't stay, if it doesn't have a legitimate outlet in your marriage on a regular basis, then he's going to be tempted to look elsewhere to have his sexual energy fulfilled somewhere else, and that's obviously in their mind sin. So therefore, by being sexually available at all times, you are basically protecting him from sexual sin. Is that a fair connection to make?
Yes, absolutely. And it's pretty clearly, and it's very, and it's made very clear that a woman's body causes a man to sin and that he has no control over his sexual urges.
Hmm.
And so we are taught to cover our bodies and not act in a promiscuous way. We are taught that if we don't fulfill our husband's needs, then he goes to porn or strip club or he cheats, whatever it may be. It's our fault because we did not fulfill our duties. So if he
Hmm.
sins, it's on us because we are basically the evil one. Eve was the one who ate the apple.
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to.
It's amazing to me how much of the Bible is anti-women. I mean, stepping back from Christ Church and their context, just how much of Christianity in general is anti-women when you look at it from the perspective of Adam and Eve. Of course, um, Eve kind of started it by being the one that gave him the fruit. And if you look at it from the Enochian perspective, where the people originally were much more involved in Enoch, in the book of Enoch, and how they described how the Watchers, the angels, fell from heaven and were so tempted by these beautiful women that they had to copulate with them and produce the Nephilim, the giants.
Mm-hmm.
And like anywhere you slice it, like women keep on being the reason that you know humans and even angels can't control themselves. Like women are just bad, bad, bad. And even in, I think it's First Timothy, talks about reasons for women to be silent, and it says the woman was deceived. She was the one in the transgression. And they build this, obviously thousands of years later, but they build it into the New Testament to tell women, be quiet, stay quiet. And you get into Titus 2, be discreet, chaste, a keeper at home, a lover of your husband and children. And you end up at a spot where women, like you're saying, really do feel like they're, as this, half of the species, half the human species, they're they're at fault for the other half's stumbling into sin. And at the same time that you're being put under this heavy burden of you're responsible for the men sinning, you're also at the same time told you need to be completely like subservient and lose your autonomy. And it really feels like, from where I'm standing now, it feels like women are just beaten at every side. And that's why I started with earlier. It feels really hard to understand how women look at this and say, this is so healthy. I love being in this community. Like, uh, I know I'm beating a
That,
dead horse there, but it just blows my mind.
well, it has a lot to do with the fact that there's a lot of shame involved. Being a woman is a matter of shame.
Hmm.
And I remember as a Christian, I hated myself. I spent the majority of my life hating myself and thinking that I was always the problem for everything. I was brainwashed to believe that I was worthless
Hmm.
unless I was doing these things. And fear and shame has so much to do with the way that they condition the members of the church, especially the women.
Are women in marriage allowed to completely enjoy themselves sexually? Like, is their pleasure still valued and talked about?
No, absolutely not. One of the things that Doug Wilson has said is that women are meant to be um, entered and conquered, and men are meant to conquer. And he has spoken publicly about how women, it's not about pleasure for them,
Hmm.
it's about serving your husband.
That just, I'm almost speechless at that. It's just
It's a
women are
task, a chore, and
they're
that's
treated
it.
like a piece of meat, basically. Like you're there as
Yes,
a Stepford
we're
wife
property.
robot.
We're
Yeah.
property.
Hmm. The fact you just said that is a great segue. How does the daughter father relationship work in that community, in terms of, are you treated as the your dad's property until you're married, or is that a separate kind of perspective? How do they see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the way we act is a direct representation of the quality of your father or your husband. My dad had to step down from being an elder because I was not silent. I was not submissive. I was acting up a lot. A lot of that had to do with the fact that I was autistic and I had ADHD. And pretty early on, I started developing borderline personality disorder due to the abuse I received and reactive attachment disorder as well. That came with depression and anxiety, and later on PTSD and complex PTSD. So I had a lot of outbursts and I had a lot of issues. I was very loud and I never did what people wanted me to. I never acted the way I was supposed to act. I was always a tomboy too. And so, due to all that, my dad had to step down as an elder to focus on his family and getting his family in order. Another part of a daughter practically belonging to the father, who's the head of the house, is that in order for any man to date her, to or court, which is how they phrase it, he has to go directly to the father and he has to ask permission as if he owns her. That's another way that the misogyny is very, very strong. You can't do anything really without your dad's permission, including
If
talking to boys.
the young man does get the dad's permission, does a girl in that community have a full say over whether it proceeds as well from her perspective? Like, if you know dad is like, yeah, this is a great guy, he's a Calvinist, he's reformed, he's more than reformed, to use Doug's words. He's an NSA grad, he is absolutely a man of God, he'll be an upstanding leader in the church as he gets older. This is a good guy, saying to his daughter, I think you should definitely consider him. What if she says, yeah, he's a nice guy, just not for me. He's not a good fit for my personality. Can she do that? Can she shut it down at that point?
Well, my brother had that happen. He and a girl were seeing each other. They were courting very privately at the time. And she really just wasn't feeling it. And so they ended up, it didn't go anywhere. But that being said, for those of us who grew up in the church and were groomed by the church, we were taught that basically our dads know a lot more than us and they know better than us, and our parents know better than us. And so we always take their opinion the next step, as it were. So if I sit down with my dad and I'm like, I'm not into this guy. I don't think he's really my type. I I'm sure the women get some sort of spiel about how great of a guy he is. And oftentimes those women cave because they're taught to not think for themselves. And so they end up in a marriage where there's not a lot of happiness, but they find, I don't want to say contentment as much as fulfillment in their role as a servant of God. They are serving their role, serving their purpose. It doesn't matter if there's passion. It doesn't matter if there's love. You do as you're supposed to as the wife. And again, it's not about pleasure. It's not about us being happy. It doesn't matter if we're happy. It matters if we are obedient.
Hmm. It well, I feel like I'm not even sure what to say sometimes. It's when I hear stuff like this, it's mind-boggling. When you mentioned the school a little bit. And by the way, for anyone that doesn't know, probably should have said this earlier, just to give a context for what we're talking about. We've mentioned Doug Wilson, pastor of Christ Church, church in Moscow, Idaho. We mentioned Logos School, which is their school for like elementary school, I believe. And they have New St.
Elementary, middle school, and high school.
And high school. Okay. And then New St. Andrews is their college. Greyfriars Hall is their grad school. Is that right? Or seminary equivalent. And
Yeah,
then they're also very involved in their books and so forth. They have something called Canon Press.
I worked
And
there.
did you? Okay. What was but before you answer that, also even their son is very much into doing stuff. Nate Wilson, he's got Hello Ninja on Netflix. He wrote some books called Hello Ninja. Now it's on a cartoon on Netflix. So they've got quite a bit of a, I don't know what you call it, but it's like a book and entertainment empire starting here. What
And
is
that's what funds the church and a lot of their ventures,
okay?
because the majority of elders and high ranking people who support Doug Wilson very strongly, they are the ones who don't just manage, but they own these companies and these businesses. And they put their funds and their tithes towards ventures that further the progress of this spiritual warfare. That's how they're buying up properties so much.
Hmm. It definitely sounds like the that game Monopoly. They want to basically buy up all the all the properties and get all the railroads. Do they do they allow teachers or administrators to spank children at school?
I was beaten at school regularly, yes.
Hmm. If you don't mind telling what was happening, like why would they do that to? Was it for like talking back to a teacher, or what was the context of when they would do that?
The first time it happened to me was due to my ADHD and autism. It was a miscommunication, and the teacher thought that I lied to her. And I tried to explain it. She wouldn't listen. Mrs. Jordan, it was in second grade, and she was the one who spanks the female students. She took me straight down to the principal's office, and she beat me with a wooden paddle bent over Matt Williams' desk while he watched. And I will never forget that, ever.
Did you?
It
I'm
was
sorry, someone was
incredibly
watching.
Matt Whitling, the principal.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Um, it was incredibly traumatic, and it took a major emotional and mental toll on me. Um, After that, I was taken home. My parents came and picked me up early, and they spanked me at home as well. Um, I, through miscommunications and actual bad behavior, I was spanked a lot of times. And not just by the female teacher. Matt Whitling would also spank me. And I learned very quickly that I hoped it was him because he didn't hit as hard as she did.
Hmm. But so you had a male administrator spanking female students.
Principal, yes.
Hmm.
It wasn't often, but it seems he singles out certain people. I was one of them. He spanked me at least twice. I know there's another girl that has spoken out about her very publicly about her experience, and she was also singled out by him.
Hmm.
And I don't know how many other female students have had that happen to them and haven't said anything.
Do you know what? Do you have any guesses as to why you were singled out?
I honestly, it could have been a convenience thing where she just wasn't that available.
Yeah. Hmm.
I don't know.
When Roy Atwood resigned, I believe it was in 2014. Is that when your dad took over as acting president?
Yes, my dad was vice president of New St. Andrews College until Mr. Atwood resigned. It was a weird overnight thing. I asked my dad because I went to see him at his office and he was in the wrong office, and I was very confused. And he said he was acting president of New St. Andrews suddenly. And for context, my dad is Bob Hieronymus. He now works at EMSI, and I don't know if the name has changed. I heard something about the company being bought, but he's been working there for quite some time. Um, the Atwood situation was off. It was strange. Still to this day, I don't know what caused it. I'm not even sure if my dad knows the full story. He wouldn't tell me anything when I asked because I'm a very curious child. Um, I was very, I was taken aback because not only did he resign pretty much overnight and nobody really knew what was going on, he went out of the country with his family, or
Hmm.
at least with his wife. I think his children were grown and pretty established at that point.
Yeah. Which, yeah, it definitely makes you at least wonder. I guess it could have easily just been he just wanted to travel, but it does make you wonder in light of the other things that the church has done. As far as you knew, how was your dad treated there?
Just fine. He loved the job. He really did. I know. I think he kind of got burnt out by the end. And I think a lot of it had to do with all the drama, um, and sweeping things under the rug and just the stress of it. He ended up transferring. Well, I honestly wasn't really sure because he didn't tell me. I'm a girl and I'm a child. I am worthless, so he's not going to confide in me certain things, right? But the whole situation with Roy Atwood, I think, was the catalyst to him leaving.
Hmm. You mentioned this at the church singing before when we were talking about the one story, but what was the church like? What was your experience going there for obviously for Sunday mornings, but were you there like more times? Was it some churches, want you there Sunday night and Wednesday night? How often were you there and what was your church experience like?
We were there every Sunday. If we had multiple services, because the congregation grew quite quickly, we would be there occasionally for both services, depending. Um, but I think the thing that stuck with me the most is how important our appearances were, not just physically, but the way we acted and the way we spoke and the way we sang and how involved we were and friendly we were to everyone, especially being one of the very well known and established families. It was important to look the part. We would be screaming at each other in the car on the way to church. And the second we enter the parking lot, it was like we became different people and we were this loving family and we were always happy. I didn't like to play into that. So I kind of act like a brat. I don't know if you see a trend here. I didn't really fit in,
I
but
see a good trend that you know how to have a voice and make sure no one tells you what to think and how to take away your autonomy. I think
yeah,
that's a trend I love to see.
absolutely, absolutely. I've always been a firecracker,
Mm.
always. And that's one of the reasons that they used me as their voice to convince city council to allow them to buy property for the school when I was very young. Um,
Can you tell me
church
more about
was,
that?
yeah, it was, it was pretty early on in their buying schemes. They just wanted some property in a adjacent lot for extra playground area. We were playing on pea gravel in a parking lot. I mean, it wasn't great. I ended up with 3 stitches in my chin because I ate it. So, I mean, a lot of kids were getting hurt. It wasn't very fun. And so they just wanted the adjacent lot for a little more room because Logos was growing. We needed more space for the kids. Um, the neighboring properties, the people that own the houses adjacent to that lot, were coming to city council saying, hey, the noise issue, we don't want to listen to this. It's going to be loud. Like, can we not allow this? And they were also, I think, advocating because they knew sort of what was going on and they had a feeling. Um, so my dad took me to the city council meeting and I stood up and I convinced them with a very compelling argument from a child to allow us to buy the land and use it for that. They quoted me a couple times in their decision making as they talked among themselves. I think it was mostly the fact that a child came forward and said, I'm having a bad experience playing on gravel. And I mentioned that kids were skinning their knees and their elbows, and it wasn't great. And they used that to make their final decision to allow us to use that property as playground.
Hmm. Interesting. I was curious, when you were there, was Doug Wilson kind of in the limelight all the time, or does it kind of cycle through? I know obviously most churches have multiple, plurality of elders. Did you see Doug Wilson a lot? Was he always speaking? Was he sometimes speaking? And I guess where I'm leading with that is was there a sense of it being a personality cult, or was it much more mellow than that, where people there would have said, "Yeah, I see Doug sometimes, but I sometimes see the other pastors just as much." Like, how did his personality come out in church?
It's the Doug Wilson cult. Everything he teaches is based on his personal beliefs and his own ego. Everything revolved around Doug Wilson. We
Hmm.
practically worshiped him. I mean, his word was the law. It really was. And if he disagreed with someone or something, so did we. His children ended up in their own little limelights with their own little shows or businesses or whatnot. Um, but it's the Doug Wilson cult.
You mentioned his daughters. The way that they treat women sounds like they want women mostly to be fairly quiet. His daughters have developed platforms. Are other women allowed to develop platforms in the same way? Like, how would that play out? And did it seem like they were an exception, or was that a natural outgrowth of just, if you're godly enough, we want
Oh
your
man,
platform to expand?
don't get me started on that. It's definitely an exception because they are Doug Wilson's daughters, which puts them up here, right? They preach the same thing he does, and they say very plainly there he uses them as tools to keep other women in line. Because
Hmm.
if these women are doing it, these holy, godly women are saying that this is okay and this is right, and they have this big platform, you think the other women aren't going to listen? We look at each other and we go, are you experiencing the same thing I am? Yes, I am, but this is how we deal with it. They're it's more than peer to peer. I mean, they're celebrities essentially, and the women in the church listen to them, and they're basically they lead all of the women's retreats, just anything to do with the women. They kind of have that. They lead the women in a way, but everything that they say and teach comes from Doug Wilson and his beliefs. And so they're allowed to have that limelight because it furthers what Doug Wilson wants.
Hmm.
But I imagine, honestly, I think any other woman in the church trying to do that would be shot down pretty quick
Yeah.
because they're not Doug Wilson's children. And there's privilege that comes with your family name.
When you were there, what would you say would be your good memories? Obviously, we're going to move towards some of the harder parts of their story, but what was something good about your recollection of your time there?
I remember loving to, well, I never loved to go to church. I would usually throw a little tantrum about it. I never really enjoyed it later on. But early on, when I had friends, I I would enjoy going to church to see my friends. And that, that was fun. The potlucks, I got to see my friends and I got to play. Um, I didn't like school very much, but I remember collecting acorns from the trees outside. Um, Playing on the swing sets was always fun. I mean, I've got a lot of fun childhood memories, but none of them really have to do with the church or the school.
Yeah. What was your first memory where you kind of said something's wrong here? Like something's not just like I had a bad day at church. Every kid has a bad day at church for some reason. You talk back to the teacher or whatever. But what was the first time where you could recollect that you look back and say, this is a different kind of church and something's radically wrong here. This is not just a bad day like everyone else has a bad day at church sometimes.
My first time at school was when I was spanked for the first time, and I think I mentioned that earlier. Um, it was a misunderstanding. They wouldn't listen to me, and I realized, wait a minute. Um, that was kind of a bit of a light bulb moment, kind of like a but it wasn't until probably a couple times of being beaten later that I realized I just don't care anymore. I'm not even going to follow the rules. They want to beat me for something that I couldn't help. So be it. I will be bad. I might as well get something out of it, right? And so I started acting out a lot after that. When it comes to church, honestly, I didn't like going to church. And once I was old enough to really refuse, I stopped going. There was one time I remember the first time I refused to go, and I was old enough to be left home alone. I stood my ground and I said, no, I'm not going. Um, I spent almost a year in Colorado for a student exchange. Their son came to stay with my family and go to New St. Andrews College. And I went to stay with his family in Colorado to go to their Christian school. And experiencing a different church for the first time in my life, I went, I feel, I feel God here. I don't feel him there. I do not feel his presence there. I do not feel the loving, kind presence or any of that energy there. I like this. I'm not going back. And so when I was 16, um, well, I may have been almost 17 when I came back to Moscow. And I never went back to Christ Church. I told my parents, I said, I'm never going back. And I found a different church to be part of from
How
there
did
on
they
out.
respond to that?
They weren't too happy, but they knew they didn't really have a choice. I was old enough to make that decision. And
Hmm.
I described exactly why I made the decision. I wasn't walking away from Christianity or from God. I just didn't, it wasn't a good fit for me. And I'd shown consistently throughout my entire childhood and young adulthood that I could not be controlled.
Yeah. It seems like that's one of the major themes. I mean, from my perspective as an atheist at this point, Christianity in any form is a cult to me. It doesn't matter if it's progressive Christianity or something as weird as Doug Wilson or JW's. Like they're all cults to me. But it seems like the recurring theme with a group like Doug Wilson's is the extremism of that control. Like they want to control you down to um, your sex life, even, which is crazy, and what you do with your mind. And I know that it's been often compared where the God character, the Yahweh character, is portrayed in the Bible as having the ability to look inside your mind and not just like judge you for your actions, but actually judge you for a bad attitude or judge you for a wrong thought. And like this
Yes,
mind control, like the celestial North Korea that Hitchens used to talk about. That's the Yahweh character, and yet because of that, God is very controlling. It's almost like, well, if God as the Father is very controlling of his people, then why would we as his church be much different? Like their goal is to control people. And
not just people, women,
yeah,
people of color mostly.
I was going to ask you on that note, did you see many people that weren't white in your experience there? Is like,
There
what's
was
the percentage?
adults, there was one, and he was going to New St. Andrews. Children, there were like four, and they were adopted by white families and whitewashed.
Hmm,
They were adopted from like Ethiopia, areas like that,
right.
overseas, because these poor Black children needed Jesus.
Hmm,
And then they whitewashed the culture right out of them. And it makes it very difficult for them to survive anywhere other than that sheltered cult.
yeah. Hmm,
Because if you don't know the history of African Americans in America or the history of racism or anything like that, as a Black person, you're not going to do well in American society today. You're not going to know how to react to any of it or how to survive any of it. You're not going to know about the police brutality against you, any of it. And it sets you up for failure unless you live in the cult as a whitewashed Black person.
hmm. Speaking of culture, I know Doug Wilson, his blog, I believe it's called Blog and Mablog. Maybe I'm
Mm-hmm.
mispronouncing that, but Blog and Mablog. I didn't grow up in my experience. I was homeschooled for many years. I didn't grow up with that direct part of his interaction with the world, but I did grow up with the it's called Credenza Agenda magazine, which I
Mm-hmm.
think he co-wrote with his wife and some other people. But as I grew up and began to be exposed to his blog and to seeing how he interacted with people like Rachel Held Evans and other people, I noticed that just like that list of words that I used quoted, from Doug about how he would speak to women or how he would call what he would call them. It seems like there's a consistent theme on his blog that he goes out of his way to not just say to the world in general, to people who aren't Christians and Bible believers and even Calvinists and Reformed people. He isn't just saying, I disagree with you. Like he wants to proverbially give them the finger. Like he wants to go out of his way to make fun of people. So if he's talking about, for example, homosexuality, he's not just going to say something like the Bible says that's wrong, or I think the Bible says it's wrong. He's going to actually start using slurs against people who are homosexual to kind of get that, like dig it in. Like he doesn't want to just say, I'm of a different opinion than you. He wants to really attack you. And I guess, he's certainly again got a great example there with Jesus, where Jesus went after people and said, "You're a whitewashed sepulcher, a whitewashed tombstone, and you're a viper." Jesus went after people this way using nasty words, and so why wouldn't Doug? He's following in the footsteps of his teacher, but he really shows a consistent desire to hit people's hot buttons. Like, tell people, where can I get people to be triggered the most? Did you see that kind of sense from him? Did you feel that while you were there?
That is a very common manipulation tactic among narcissists. And he uses it specifically because he uses shame and fear to control his congregation, especially the women. If there's so much shame and fear associated with being this way, being gay, being trans, not being submissive to your husband, not doing your dishes, speaking out too loudly, if you are ashamed to be even associated with anyone like that, do you think you're going to follow that? Do you think you're going to become that? Do you think you're going to show that you're that? For individuals in the community who were gay or trans later on came out openly about that, it was they couldn't, and they had to fit in the mold because you see him calling these people these names, and you see the shame and the hatred and the fear and all that. It's just a tactic to control his congregation. That's why he's so loud about it.
Do you remember any examples or stories that you saw or heard about specifically how he would treat someone who came out that might have been in his church or even in the community?
They're shunned.
Hmm,
They're shunned and basically put on the prayer list for being in sin. And if that doesn't work, they are excommunicated. And even their families will shun them at that point, especially if you're gay or trans. I have a friend who is trans, and they I've got two friends actually from that church who are now have transitioned, and their own family. Well, one of them, their own family wouldn't talk to them and basically kicked them out of the family. And for the other one, their family thankfully wasn't super into Christ Church as much, and they're a lot more understanding, but there's still some tension there. But yeah, the church has nothing to do with them. They're excommunicated.
What does that like? I know Amish shunning, like we're not even going to talk to you. What would shunning look like for them? Like if you,
I experienced it myself. They just don't talk to you. If they see you in the grocery store and it's somebody, let's say a mom of my best friend who maybe babysat me, if they see, they don't want to make eye contact. They act
mm,
like they don't know you. And if they're forced to talk to you or say anything to you, it's just forced pleasantries and it's very uncomfortable.
that's crazy. How do you think they would reconcile that with the desire to share the gospel with the lost, including people that even grew up in their congregation? Like the sense of if you're in their shoes, I would think then they're the more that you, from their perspective, are disobeying the word of God, bucking the church's authority, you're obviously putting yourself in a very dangerous spot. And they can't see your soul. They don't know where you are with Christ. But from their perspective, if you're really on that thin ice, then you're very much in danger of hell. And I believe Doug believes in eternal conscious torment. Is that right? Hellfire. So
Yes.
you're picturesquely speaking, you are this person in a burning house that you're on the first floor and the fire's on the top, and eventually it's going to get down and get to you. But there's some time to rescue you. Um, but they can see the fire is coming your direction and it's coming fast. You would think that the motivation would be, we need to help Lorena get out away from the fire. Like that's the most
That
loving
is
thing to do. Why would like what do you think they would say to that?
that is the first reaction. You go on the prayer list and everybody kind of rallies around you a little bit to try to bring you back to Christ from your sin or whatever, and you get counseling and all that. If you reject that, if you step out from that and you don't want it, and you're not easily controlled, then the shunning starts. Then, like, it's after the excommunication.
Hmm.
So, yeah, they tried. They tried. But
What happened in your specific story? Like, as you said, you weren't going to the church anymore. What were the next few months and years after that like for you?
well, being autistic and having many disabilities as a result of the abuse that I received at school and from my family, I didn't have any friends. I lost them all in elementary school because I couldn't pick up social cues and I wasn't cool enough. And even my brother ended up turning away from me because I was embarrassing because I was a little sister. Um, I didn't have any friends. So I didn't experience the shunning the same way everybody else may have who was shunned. I I was mentally out long before I left. But once I left, it was like there was a weight off my shoulders. I didn't want to be around these people anymore. I didn't like them. They weren't nice to me because I was different. I had experienced so much trauma there that I didn't miss any of it at all. I chose to walk away from the entire community, not vice versa. So my situation was very different. But again, in public, they don't want to talk to me. They don't want to be seen with me or associated, especially now that I'm no longer a Christian. Um, I, yeah, it was, it's very interesting to see. I don't know what's said about me. Nobody's told me. And I don't think I was pretty openly living in sin from the time I was 17. I was sleeping around, I was drinking, I was doing all the things you're not supposed to do as a Christian. But I still considered myself Christian. And later on, I became a very devout individual. But that quickly ended, and I deconverted.
Hmm.
So I mean, I shunned them in my situation because I knew that all of it was messed up. I knew it was wrong and I hated it. I didn't want anything to do with it. Um, I quickly became friends with others who were shunned and listened to them advocate, and I had their backs on that a lot. I moved away and I lost touch with everyone and all of it pretty completely. I cut it off pretty completely. So if I was on a prayer list or if I was excommunicated, I don't know. I know I wouldn't be welcome back in that building.
Yeah.
Um, but my parents still talk to me. They live in Florida now. They just moved from North Carolina to Florida. Um, I told them about doing these interviews because I needed to give them a heads up because my dad works at MZ and I'm not sure how controlled MZ is still by the church. And I do know that they're still part of the CREC congregation. So I gave them a forewarning and I didn't hear from my mom for a few days after that. And our next conversation, she sounded really tense and stuff. Um,
Mm.
but I mean, there's still, my mom and I have a better relationship than we've ever had. She's apologized for all of her part. And she recognizes very openly that the way she treated me, due to the way she was taught to treat me, was wrong.
That's
And
awesome.
we've reconciled very much through that. My dad, he's not as willing to admit that it was wrong because the thing about being a man in Christchurch is that it comes with a lot of privilege and all the things they teach, women being subservient, serving men. I mean, the men benefit everything, everything. And so they don't really want to admit that it's wrong because they could lose so much.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
Yeah.
On that note, I was curious, did you ever get involved with what's called the Big House? Were you part of that at all?
I have heard of it, but no, I never
Okay.
wasn't involved with that one.
All right. So I was just curious. I do want to ask, I know this is mostly about, the topic of Christchurch and Doug Wilson, but just have to ask what caused you to deconvert? Like what was that? Because most people that grew up in that, even if you have a hurt, that from my experience doesn't necessarily lead you to deconvert. It might lead you to a more liberal, loving version of God. Whatever, you'd say, take away the bad stuff and, let's do a gentle Jesus, meek and mild kind of experience. But you're saying you didn't leave Christchurch, only you left Christianity. What caused that?
I was a Christian until 5 years ago. Well, 6 years ago. Um, it was interesting because I did switch over to a more liberal Jesus. I went to churches that supported gay rights and trans rights, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot. I even went to a black church at one point, and that was very interesting, eye opening. Um, I think it kind of started when I went to a church that stated hell wasn't real. Isn't that the whole point of Christianity? Be afraid because you're going to go to hell? I'm going, how could this not be true? He explained because he reads ancient Hebrew and he'd read the actual text. He knew what it said, and he said something along the lines of hell isn't real because it was a place that wasn't mentioned until the New Testament, and it was actually a valley outside of a large city that was filled with trash and was kept burning all the time. And it just constantly was burning. I was like, well, that's odd. And then I remembered back to a sermon at the second church I attended that said Revelation wasn't about end times. Revelation actually already happened. If you translate the text correctly and you know the historical significance, they were using coded messages, and the dragons were the Romans. And the beast with the wound on its head was the Caesar at the time, who was wounded in battle and survived a head wound. And all of it tied in and made sense. And I'm just going, wait a minute. So the translations are all over the place. Every single church I'm going to translates these things differently. Which one's real? And then it was like, I wonder about these questions I asked my mom and dad. and was told that's not for us to know, that's for God to know. So I started asking questions again, and I started researching on my own. And I found so many discrepancies. The entire religion crumbled as I asked questions. That's all it takes. You just have to ask questions and not blindly believe. You have critical thinking skills. There's no chance you can get caught up in that bullshit. Excuse my language. It crumbled, all of it, to dust. There's nothing for it to stand on. And then I was introduced to spirituality, different spirituality, and that fit me a lot better. And I spent the last 5 years deconverting and deconstructing all of the hurt. I uh, I have permanent disabilities due to the abuse that I received at Christ Church. I have permanent disabilities and trauma due to Christianity itself.
Mm.
And being freed, I cannot tell you the amount of fear I felt at first, fear of hell, but then I remembered some Christians don't even believe in hell. How can it be real? Once I got over the fear, the freedom, the sense of total weightlessness, being able to live in a way that made me happy, allowing myself to be happy. I didn't think I was allowed to be happy or choose a path that I liked. And that was the most freeing thing I've ever experienced. And now I have a full time career in the disability field as an advocate. And I have my own place that I pay for myself. I have my own car that I pay for myself. I have a life that I've built, and I have friends, and I have a community. And it is so much better than what they wanted for me. I can't tell you how grateful I am that I didn't stay.
Mm. When you broadened it out to Christianity being part of the trauma, you mentioned hell. Was there anything else that comes to mind when you think about the trauma that Christianity caused you?
My sense of worthlessness as a woman,
Mm.
I hated myself. I only just recently, this last year, stopped hating myself, stopped feeling
Mm.
like I was worthless and disgusting. And that's been an ongoing journey for a very long time. And I still struggle with it to this day, my sense of self-worth because I'm a woman.
Mm. It breaks my heart to hear it, and I'm so glad that you did obviously philosophically move on from that stuff. But I know it's a lot of it's like tree roots. You can chop the tree down, but the roots are still very deep, and it takes a while. And sometimes I feel like I've been out for a little over 3 years. I escaped in about this October of 2019. I had about 3 years where I was just trying to figure out why things didn't make sense anymore. Like you said, it crumbles. It's like sand going through your fingers, and you just can't stop it.
It is.
Um, and I Mine started with more the issue of Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. We're just singing the song as you do with kids, doing Bible time and devotional time, and we had done it before for many, many times, but we're singing Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and I'm thinking, I know what happens next in that story. And I thought, do I really want to teach my kids genocide? And how do I teach? It was more at first like, how do I teach them genocide? When do I teach them genocide is acceptable for God's sake? And then it was like, do I want to do that? And it was like, well, wait, why wouldn't you want to do it if you're on God's side? Why can't you preach the word? Why would you want to filter the Bible? And I was like, I just struggled with it. And as you do, you stumble upon information that slowly, like you said, with the discrepancies and so forth. And it was both an issue of I learned more, but I was also shaken up by how much I think the church leaders knew about that information that they never told me.
Yeah.
And I'm sure some didn't. I'm not blaming everybody, but I'm sure some of them did, and they never said a word about it. And I thought, why wouldn't someone bring up this other stuff? And it kind of became clear to me that they're trying to kind of, again, going back to this control word, they're trying to control the narrative. And so, for example, I was going to read a short list here, but I found the New Testament quotes the book of Enoch well over 100 times, which I was like, that's a lot. I mean, I grew up thinking it quotes it twice, like in Jude and wherever the other one is. But I thought, like, come on, like it's twice. But that was enough to make me wonder, like, why is Jude quoting Enoch? But then when I found over 100 quotes from the book of Enoch in the New Testament, I thought, I went to Bible college to be a pastor. Somebody should have told me that. And there's a,
They had the Book of Enoch very well. There's a couple other books, I don't remember the names of them, but they hide those as well. One was written by a woman,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
part of the narrative of controlling and silencing women.
yep. And then I found they were doing quotes from the Wisdom of Solomon, from Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, from Baruch, from Esdras, Jubilees, Judith, Tobit, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Assumption of Moses, the Book of Jasher, the Life of Adam and Eve, and the Apocalypse of Zephaniah. I was like, wait a second, why aren't you all talking about these other books? And then it was like, okay,
Mhm.
wait, there's 4 Gospels. No, there's actually like 60 of them. Why do we pick these 4? We don't know who wrote them. Then I'm like, there's like multiple endings of Mark, and why didn't you tell me there's a lot of endings, and it makes a difference? Some of them don't end with a resurrection. Some of them just end with, we don't know what happened to him. Um, and then what really got me, I think what really took me over the edge was realizing how much of it was directly a copycat from Homer's work. If you're familiar with the work of Dr. Dennis MacDonald, he's done fantastic work showing how if you look in the story, especially of Homer's Odyssey, where
Mhm.
Odysseus is trying to get home after the Battle of Troy and all
Yeah.
those adventures, a lot of those stories are copycatted even to like quoting Homer in the New Testament. I'm like, come on, we're not talking like one or two. We're talking like dozens and dozens and dozens of instances where the Odyssey is woven into the New Testament. And I just thought this eventually, that's just again the tip of the iceberg, but eventually you pile these things on and it doesn't make sense. And you realize they never told you. And you get to a point where you're just like, this, if this is from God, this is a really crappy job because this sounds really
Yeah.
fishy at this point. And I remember 3 years ago, just I was sitting at this computer and it was a Saturday morning, and I thought, for the first time in my life, but this this doesn't sound real. Is that possible? Is it possible that the God I've been talking to and worshiping all this time and living my life for is not real? And my immediate catch back was like, there's no way that millions upon millions of people for thousands of years have been duped. There's no way. And I kind of just sat and listened to myself saying that. And I was like, that's not true. It's easily possible that for thousands of years we've been duped. And we would say the same thing about other religions. We'd say this religion, that religion, they've been around for thousands of years, some of them even predating Christianity and Judaism. We'd say they were deceived for thousands of years. Why couldn't we have been? And I described as like if you have how they set up dominoes and you hit the first one and they fall.
Mhm.
It was like in those 3 years, I had been a mile away from my dominoes and I was kicking. But it was making no difference because I wasn't close enough to the dominoes. I was a mile away. But in those 3 years, I just slowly took little micro steps. And eventually I took like one last step. And it was that final question, is it even possible this isn't real? And as soon as I did, it was like I kicked and they all just fell. And within an hour, I was like, this is completely mythology. And I mean, I
Yeah.
was fully out immediately.
It's a process to get there for sure because there's a lot of fear involved. It's hard to get past fear. That's why they use it. That's why they preach hell. That's why they shun. That's why, all of those things. Um, I think for me, it was more about the fact that whether or not he's real, God is a jerk. He's a narcissist. He is
Yes.
abusive. All the people he murders, millions, and all the people that were killed in his name after, like in the Crusades, I, it's I do not want to follow somebody who condones the murder of an entire city, including women, children, and pregnant mothers, and the animals. Just slaughter them all. He's a monster.
Yeah.
Why would
But
I
save the young
want to
virgins.
follow? Yeah. Well, no, they said kill them too.
Well, there was at least one section where he said you're supposed to save the virgins in one of the cities.
Oh,
You
the
can
one
kill
I was
everybody,
referring.
but save the
Yeah,
virgin.
I'm not surprised by that. Yeah.
Mm,
And then, of course, let's mutilate all the men that follow this religion.
yeah.
Let's murder babies. Let's, like,
And the
why would I
blood,
want to follow a god like that?
and it's so clearly from so much of it's from Egypt and Samaria. It's like Egypt had a pork taboo, Egypt had a Sabbath, Egypt did
Yeah.
circumcision, Egypt did blood magic, and it's like, come on, this. we can see where this stuff evolved from. And if your God is so holy and separate, why isn't he different? Um,
A
it,
load
it,
of
it
crap.
I'm curious, now that we're talking about this topic, do you do you think there's some people in Christchurch who really secretly know it's mythology, but it's just this is their culture and they like, some people I get the sense like they're at church because they want to go back to 1950s white American Christianity, the Leave It to Beaver kind of era, if you know that show. And it's
Yeah.
just they might get some sense that it doesn't really matter in one sense if this is real. I want my America to look like this. And
Oh,
Christchurch, Moscow is
absolutely.
starting to look like this.
Yeah. I think that there are probably people like that. There are also people that are mentally out. They're physically in, mentally out. They don't want to lose the community or anything like that, but they're mentally just, they don't match up anymore with it and they see what's wrong, but they don't want to leave because there's consequences to leaving. And a lot of those people, they'll wait years before they find an easy out and they'll usually move
Hmm.
into oftentimes across the country or to another state. And that gives them an excuse to leave and find another church and get out. And they slowly just kind of lose contact with their old friends. So it's not a sudden loss of all community. They are able to kind of build a community while the other one kind of just fades away. Um, there's a lot of that, but then there's a lot of people that I'm sure there's at least several women that are being severely abused right now that don't want to come forward and say anything because they think it's okay. But it's not. And I am here to share my story and everything I saw to help the people that are being abused right now and don't feel like they have a voice. It's okay to speak up. It is. And abuse is never okay in any form. And even if he is real and if he is the loving father that is preached, he wouldn't condone that. You think Jesus would condone that? He saved a prostitute from being stoned. I mean, if you look at his works, he partied with prostitutes. He turned water into wine. He was nothing like the people in Christchurch. Nothing like them. It's not okay to abuse. It's not. And if you're being abused, get out. It's worth it.
Hmm.
It was for me.
Amazing words. I hope that some people that I don't know if they'll listen to this uh, podcast because of its connections with atheism, but wherever people are listening to, I hope that they're aware that there is a path out. You can obviously still stay a Christian if you really believe it's true, but you don't have
Absolutely.
to spend your life being abused. You just don't. Like there's a
Absolutely.
different path, and especially the idea of like your voice is just you need to just basically shut up. You just need to let the men do all the talking, let the men do all the leading, and let the men, control your body and everything. And it's infuriating. I mean, it gets to a point where you're like this in this day and age. I mean, if we were living in the 1600s, I'd expect some societies to do this,
Yeah,
even maybe the 1800s. But I mean, come on, it's 2022. It's time for this stuff to end. It really is. I mean, in my opinion, it's time for the whole mythology of it to end. But at least this whole domination of women, it's time for it to end. It's time for people to realize we're equals. And I have two little girls. It's they're just 2 and 6, and it breaks my heart to think about that. And I love that I can. What I do with them is I will tell them just like if someone says, "Hey, can I give you a hug?" You can say no. I'll say it just like that, and I'll use different words in autonomy, but I'll say you have the power over who gives you a hug. You get to say no, but I'll connect it and say who gets to decide what you believe, and they know the answer. They get to say I do. I get to decide what I believe, and they love it. They kind of shout it like they're so excited, and I get to tell them. I literally paint it like a bubble. I'll say, all right, I'm gonna I'll practice with them, and I'll say I want you to pretend that there's a bubble around you. It's in and I tell them I use big words sometimes. I say it's your worldview bubble. It's what you really believe about yourself and the whole world. And I'll say I'm going to pretend that I'm going to make you believe just like me. And I'll push my hand in toward them and I'll say, you have to think just like daddy. And they know that the answer that they can give is no. And I'll do it. You have to believe just like me. You have to be an atheist. No, I don't. You have to be a Christian. No, I don't. You have to believe like the church. No, I don't. And we go through it a few times and they end up getting this strong picture like, I'm allowed to say no. I'm allowed to say, have my own perspective on this. And you cannot make me into a clone or into a whatever. We obviously don't want kids to just go around bashing each other's heads. There's some things that they can't do, but
Yeah.
there's this autonomy that goes beyond just the physical autonomy of your, giving a hug. It's like there's a thought autonomy that you can give to the next generation, and my heart just beats and it breaks for the especially the women of the next generation to be able to get that freedom for the first time.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And if that's the kind of life you want, if you want to be the stay-at-home wife and mother, that's great, but you don't have to accept abuse. You do not, because it's not right. And Jesus wouldn't condone it for those of you that are trapped in that. It's okay to leave.
Yeah.
It's healthy to leave. And I really hope that my words eventually, with all these interviews, reach those that are considering moving to Moscow to join the church. Stay away. It's toxic, it's dangerous, and your children will be abused,
Mm,
especially the young girls.
yeah. Thank you for that warning. I hope people will take that seriously. I know I've asked you a whole bunch of questions. Was there any other parts of your story that, or even just anything on your heart that we didn't get to that you wanted to bring into the interview?
I think we covered a lot of it. I'm sure other parts will come up as other people ask me questions in other interviews. And as you and I do another interview down the road, more might come up. A lot of it, unfortunately, my brain is blocked. And I realized that when I was trying to sit down and write my story, it's hard to string it all together without somebody asking me specific questions. And I don't have a lot of memory of some of it because my brain blocked it. And I'm hoping through this process, it will help to bring those memories back forward so that I can share them as well. But I just want to say I don't blame my parents for any of the abuse I received. They were just as brainwashed as the rest of everyone else.
Hmm.
And they are aware of the harm it caused me and they have apologized and we have a good relationship. Um, so I don't want anybody reaching out to, you know, say anything to them. This is going to be hard enough because they're still in CREC. Um, I have no hard feelings against them. I've forgiven them completely. I've forgiven everybody that hurt me, and I've found peace in that. Even Doug Wilson.
Hmm.
I don't I don't hold bitterness for any of it because that doesn't serve me in any way. And bitterness is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. It just doesn't work. And all it does is it hurts you and ruins your life. So I've moved on and I have no connection whatsoever to any of them. And so as I do my interviews, I am not at any risk. I can name names. I can I can speak about things that a lot of people may be afraid to. I can be very frank and straightforward, and I don't have to be anonymous because they can't touch me.
Hmm. That's awesome.
So
I I did just want to ditto to what you were just saying about the forgiveness issue and just the general peace. It's amazing when you step away from all these things, you do get that initial um self-questioning when you leave a cult and when you leave Christianity of maybe it's me, maybe I'm the problem, maybe it could be as horrible as maybe Satan is deceiving me. Maybe I just
yeah,
want to sin. Maybe there's a secret part of me that doesn't want to bow my knee to Christ and his sovereignty, and so forth. But when you get away from all that, self-questioning and you just kind of get to the freedom part you mentioned, it really is true. You get to a point where you realize so many of these issues that you spent so much of your time thinking about, both from these deep theological questions and the what when's the Lord coming back, which mill, post mill, whatever, which mill am I, and all these theology questions and even just the general questions of like, why don't I have the joy of the Lord today, and why do I know I should pray for the lost, but somehow I'd rather watch a football game, and from going back to the sexual stuff, why am I tempted to think certain thoughts when I should be simply more bowing my knee to Christ and taking every thought captive to him? And you just all these things that consumed you for years, and you realize none of it was ever real, none of it ever mattered. And you literally kind of like you remember that movie, The Matrix, Neo,
Yeah.
when they first pull him out of the Matrix and they're rebuilding his body with those acupuncture things, and he first opens his eyes and he says, why do my eyes hurt? And they say, because you've never used them before. And it's like you realize
Yes.
you don't know who you were. Like you're like, if my identity was in Christ and my identity was in the church and the kingdom and heaven and the gospel and the Bible, and you realize eventually this has all ever been mythology and nothing but mythology, you're like, then I don't know who I am.
You
And it's
have to
it
rediscover who you are.
yeah,
You have to learn who you are. You have to learn what you actually like to do. It's incredible, the journey. And it's really hard. And it can be very daunting at first, but it's so worth it.
it is. Absolutely. And the when you get kind of past your angry phase, which a lot of us go through, you get past the
Ugh,
whole just the craziness of it. There's a lot of little phases. It's
yeah.
it's a true grieving process, but eventually you kind of get grounded, you settle down, and you're like, okay, it happened. It is what it is. I was in a cult, not just Christ Church cult, but I was in the cult of Christianity. I was stuck. I'm free now. I'm really glad I'm free. I feel like I won the lottery. I've got hopefully some time left. So what do I do with the time I've got left now that I'm free? Let's make the best of this.
Enjoy the heck out of life.
Yes.
Out of all the things you weren't allowed to do before, everything in moderation, though.
Yeah.
Don't do drugs.
And leave it better than you found it. But
Yes.
just the joy part of it to mention that like it really does free you. You realize I'm free to be happy, and it's not because of some Greco-Roman mystery cult demigod who really needs blood magic to make things okay.
No.
It's like I am just free to just enjoy life and to make it doesn't have a meaning because of an ancient book. But I get to make a meaning for it. I get to give it meaning if I
Mhm.
how I want to. And the beauty of that, and the beauty of being able to see other people for the first time, not through this grid of, are you under the umbrella of God
That,
the Father, Christ, the
that.
church.
Yeah.
It's like you're just another person, and I don't need to convert you to Christ. I just need to hear your story, and it's so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Absolutely, it is. And I can tell you that it wasn't until probably a couple years after I left Christianity that I started to feel truly happy. It took years for me to get to the point that I feel joy and I feel happy and I love myself. It's mind blowing. I've never been so happy in my life, and I've never been so grateful to have found truth.
Have you come across any other ladies who either from the Christ Church background or just from a general church background who've been able to kind of resonate with you and where you've been able to talk through those things with them and kind of help them in their journey?
I've seen a few, yeah. A lot of them don't like to speak up about it because it's very traumatizing at times.
Yeah.
Um, it's a lot of stuff we don't want to relive. I've had to work through it in therapy for years, and I'm still in therapy now. Um, I it's a part of our lives that we like to leave behind us and pretend never happened because they're very traumatic. And that's okay. To each their own. If that's how you work through it, that's fine. Um, it's taken me from the time I was 17 till now to speak up about my experience. So that should say a lot about the way that it affects, especially women. Um,
What prompted you to speak
yeah,
up now?
something felt right. It just felt right. I saw certain things fall into place, and certain people came out with stories a while back, but it didn't feel like the right time. And finally, now something kind of clicked into place, and I realized now's a good time. Now it feels like the right time to move forward with this and see if I can help advocate for all those who are trapped and potentially could become trapped by the cult. And maybe down the road, my testimony will help to take Moscow back from these white supremacists.
Yeah. Well said. Well, I just want to say I thank you so much for sharing your story. Obviously, the biggest thing of all I'm grateful for is that you did escape Christianity. I'm so glad you got out. But I'm glad too in the specific sort of subtopic here that I'm glad you escaped from Christchurch and the Doug Wilson cult and all that. And I appreciate you being willing to speak up. I know that it's not easy because they're painful things, but also we know that they're a group that does have a very vindictive streak to them. And, just knowing that that's who we're talking about and that's who you're dealing with. I appreciate your willingness to speak up, both to, share your story, but also to warn other people that, that might be thinking, oh, this is the place for me. Like, before you make that move, do a little digging. It's not that hard to find. I mean, you
Yeah,
Google
here's the
stuff, you can
story of
find,
somebody who grew up in that cult and can tell you exactly how they treat women and children because she is a woman, she was a child in that cult.
yep. And all those abuse stories that we touched on, it's not hard to find those either. I did
Mm-mm.
want to mention, just as a side note, there's a Facebook group that I'm going to put a link for underneath our video. I believe it's called Examining Doug Wilson and
And Moscow,
Christchurch,
Idaho.
Moscow, Idaho, excuse me. Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho. For anyone that is like, I don't know what this is, but I'm really curious, or if you know enough to know you're disgusted by what's happening there, but you do want to understand it better. I've seen some very interesting things on that page that help people to
Very detailed information. They cover everything that's coming out of that cult and that surrounding area. I would definitely suggest it to anybody that doesn't know really what's going on and is curious, or does know but doesn't have a whole lot of information. I really appreciate their page.
yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much. We've been speaking with Lorena Hieronymus. Thank you so much, Lorena, for telling your story. I definitely want to catch up with you again and do some more digging. I'm excited to hear that you're going to be working with my colleague as well, Derek Lambert on Myth Vision shortly. His platform is amazing. I'm so glad you're going to get a chance to tell your story there. But thank you. It's been great to get to know you, and I appreciate your willingness to speak up.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I look forward to working more with you in the future.
Awesome. Thank you again. Have a great night.
You too.